Hello and welcome to 5-Year Club video number 299. Tonight we will be reading an article, I think it's an interview transcript, with Ray Dalio, where he discusses the anatomy of the debt cycle. And the debt cycle is, this thing where there's a lot of credit becomes available, and so people take out debt. They use this debt to buy stuff, right? And then because other people are also buying stuff, that stuff goes up in value, so the people feel rich. And because the stuff is increased in value, they also feel like they can qualify for even more debt, and so they take on more debt. And eventually, it all comes kind of crashing down. We saw this in the countries, European countries, after 2008, when credit dried up, specifically Iceland and Ireland. Those were countries where assets, real estate, in the case of Ireland, and Iceland, the case of just a lot of different things, had been bid up, essentially using, like outside money, like loans from other countries. And that has caused a lot of suffering in those places. Anyway, unemployment's at an all-time low right now, and the market has done really well for the last 9 years. Real estate has done really well, and credit is obviously really available. The Fed is increasing interest rates recently, which is obviously making credit a little bit less available. And I think the hope there is to kind of put the brakes on the growth of assets and to put the brakes on some of the unwise debt that's being taken out. But historically speaking, the Fed has not been able to prevent debt cycle related crashes. And in general, if you just look at all the different financial stuff that's happened, 2000, 2008, 1987, the Fed just hasn't been able to stabilize the economy overall. We're still seeing big swings in both directions, and this idea that essentially controlled authority can balance the availability of money to prevent bad things from happening. It's a fantasy. Anyway, it's a demonstrated fantasy if you read the history. So let's read this article. Ray Dalio discusses the anatomy of the debt cycle. Ray Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund. He predicted the 2008 financial crisis a year earlier, and Bridgewater can be counted as one of the survivors of that crisis. He recently released a new book titled A Template for Understanding Big Debt Crises. Oh, that's really cool. I'm going to go see if I can read that book or get it on Audible, in which he touches upon the symptomatic and historic nature of debt cycles and explains how a better understanding of how these cycles function can work in our favor. He spoke to Marketplace Morning Report host David Brancaccio about these cycles, as well as the state of the economy today. Below is an edited transcript of the conversation. This template that you're offering, this book, this is about noticing that we go through these cycles. They're not every 18 months. They're long cycles of lending is easy, borrowing gets crazy, things start to go bust, policymakers respond, and credit gets tight. And you think you could really understand that if you have any hope of prospering. Maybe it's if you could really understand that you have any... I don't understand the sentence. I guess we should listen to the audio. And you think you could really understand that if you have any hope of prospering. Ray Dalio. It's my job. I live and die on that. There are 6 stages of those, okay? There's healthy debt growth, and then healthy debt growth leads to extrapolating past trends and thinking those things that went up are going to continue to go up, and then they borrow money to do that, and that is called a bubble. You can anticipate whether those debts can be paid off. Then there is a top, and that top is usually because central banks then need to tighten, slow things down, or because those debts can't be paid. And so the bubble bursts, and then there is a contraction. And the worst ones are the ones when we hit zero interest rates, and those are called depressions. And because you hit zero interest rates, monetary policy can't be the same, and they inevitably print money to buy financial assets, push those financial assets up in value, and that is what we've been through. Brancaccio. So where are we on the cycle now? The cycle of history, the cycle of economics. So where are we on the cycle now? The cycle of history, the cycle of economics. I think the most analogous period is 1935 to 1940. When you have a big debt crisis and you hit zero in interest rates, and then they're trying to relieve that debt crisis, that hitting zero produces a big debt crisis. That's why 1929 to 1932 and 2007 to 2009 are analogous. They were big debt crises. Hit zero interest rates. In both of those cases, the Federal Reserve has to print money and buy a lot of financial assets. That causes financial asset prices to rise, and it also causes the economy to improve, but it also widens the wealth gap, and as a result, we have a wealth gap today that is quite similar to the wealth gap that existed then. Big wealth gaps produce populism and produce conflict between the left and the right, or the haves and the have-nots. We are also in a period of time, very much like the 1935 to 1940 period, in which the conflict is not only domestic, internal conflict among countries, it's between countries. Because when we elect populist leaders, they are strong nationalist leaders who tend to have conflict. So we're in a position in which there is a rising power in the form of China and an existing power in the form of the United States. Through history, there's a pattern in when that rivalry happens of conflict. There's a pattern in when that rivalry happens of conflict. Okay. At first, that's economic conflict, and then later it becomes even military conflict. I think the situation in China is quite similar to the situation with Japan in the post-World War II period. Brancaccio. That's starting to be scary if you're drawing that analogy. Dalio. I don't mean to scare anybody, but I do think it's important to realize that we do have a competitive situation with China. That means conflict of some form, and how that conflict is handled should be considered in light of history. In other words, there are good ways of doing that, and there are bad ways of doing that, more dangerous. And it's a delicate situation, so yes, there are economic conflicts internally. It may sound scary that we have the left and the right at odds, or that we may have a wealth gap, but we should recognize those things and we should deal with them. Brancaccio. So is it your view that the way that we're pursuing our trade policy in this burgeoning trade war that the U.S. has with China, are we doing it, in your view, in a prudent fashion? Dalio. I think there are two ways that negotiations take place. Do we have a negotiation, a hard, strong negotiation in which there's mutual respect in that negotiation, or do you have a war? Just using the term trade war is something that's significant. If the game is, I'm going to hurt you more than you're going to hurt me, and you play that game, that's a dangerous game. Brancaccio. I know you see these cycles in history, but there's that line about history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. If we are in a position now that's similar to the late 1930s to 1940, it doesn't mean the outcome has to be what we saw in the middle of the 20th century. Dalio. Not at all. There's a concept called the Thucydides' trap. And basically, it means when there's a rising power during an existing world power, there is a probability of war. Over the last 500 years, that's happened 16 times. In 12 of those times, there were wars, and in 4 of those times, there were not wars. It's one of those situations in which there can be ways of dealing with this in a way that brings around mutual prosperity. But if you're going to hurt the other and you're exchanging hurts to the other, it's a risky situation. Brancaccio, so we should be careful is what you're saying. Dalio, we should be careful, I think. Brancaccio, given all that, you still don't see a recession looming in the U.S. economy. Dalio, no. This is interesting to me. No, in the business cycle, that happens when capacity is contracted and inflation is accelerating and tightness of monetary policy. Those conditions I don't see anytime soon. I think we're in the 16th or 17th inning of the game in terms of that cycle. In terms of the long-term debt cycle, in other words, where debt levels are still high and other benefits like pension benefits and healthcare benefits, they're large. And we have zero interest rates, and we've then had quantitative easing, which has pushed up asset prices. We've stretched that cycle pretty far. So the long-term debt cycle, I think, is pretty stretched. The wealth gap is pretty large. But the business cycle that we're in has probably a few more innings. No, I'm more worried about what will happen when that cycle runs its course in maybe 2-3 years. I can't say exactly when. Brancaccio, and is it your sense that a little wealth redistribution might be in order at this stage in the current debt cycle? Dalio, I think the biggest issue in our wealth is our wealth and opportunity gap, and I would say that it should be made as a national priority to deal with that with metrics. You have to redistribute opportunity to create productivity. That segment has got to be productive. It's not good for them psychologically as well as economically. Capitalism has to be made to work for the majority of people, otherwise it's not safe and it's not fair. What's redistributing opportunity? It's training, it's education. Dalio, I think you could create public-private partnerships in which there is productive uses of money to do programs like education, quality education, job education, and microfinance, and the like, in which there's payoffs. The private sector would be able to evaluate whether there's going to be payoffs. When you think about what it costs to get a student through high school, and then you look at the cost of the incarceration rates, it's between $85,000 a year to $125,000 a year. 22% of the high school students in Connecticut, which is the richest state in the country, are either disengaged or disconnected. That means they're participating in school, but they don't study or they don't even know where they are. When you think of the cost of that to our society in terms of all its costs, its crime rates, the incarceration rates, there are many ways, but in any case, let's at least define it as a national emergency, establish metrics, and bring in private-public partnerships to view that as a national agenda in much the same way as there's a space program. I gotta say, I like the way that Dalio thinks in this, because, you say, is it time to redistribute wealth? Just a little bit of wealth redistribution, wouldn't that work? And I think that when people talk about wealth redistribution, they're missing. They have a very shallow view of what got us here in the first place. Like what gets somebody into a place where they're not earning any money and they don't have any money is not the fact that they don't have any money. It's that they don't have an education that allows them to do productive work, or they're not in a location where there is productive work. And bringing productive work to their location is not something that you can do in 2 seconds. And educating them in a productive field is not something that you can do in 2 seconds. It's not something that giving them an extra $2,000, an extra $25,000 is going to solve. So you can't frame the problem as a wealth problem. It's not a wealth problem. It's a productivity problem. And you can look at what's behind that. That's exactly what Dalio is talking about. You can look and talk about education, because obviously education is part of that. But it's not the whole enchilada, burrito. It's not the whole burrito. It's not the whole taco, whatever. It's more complicated than that. I think one thing that I've noticed since I started working is that, like, the official job training programs, especially at small companies, are terrible. They're not very good. We don't do as many internships and things as we could. And so I think that if we encouraged more of that, if there were more high school students hanging out where I work and learning more about what I do on a daily basis, they would have a much better chance at pursuing the right education in college to make more money than if they just took some random liberal arts major and then figured it out later. Brancaccio. Since we're talking about debt cycles, I have to ask you this. The other day, I sat down with the people who brought us the Dodd-Frank financial reform law. Former Congressman Barney Frank says there will be no more government bailouts of companies that are allowed then to live on. If there is a future bailout under the law, those companies will have to be forced out of business. Barney Frank and former Senator Chris Dodd are proud of that. Is that how you see it? There will be no more bailouts of the sort in which institutions live on? I don't believe this for a second, by the way. I don't know what these guys were saying, but I don't believe that for a second. Dalio. While they have made, in many cases, the system safe, they've also created such rigid rules that rigidity is in and of itself a threat. Every cycle is different than the one before, in certain ways, in terms of its applications. And when you say thou shalt not, and you don't make room for exceptions, you are exposing yourself to a great vulnerability. I will say that there will come a day that you will need to make those moves. I think that there should be a Special Economic Emergency Powers Act when the President of the United States and the head of the Federal Reserve and the representatives of both houses and of Congress say that this is one of those cases in which the rules are not exactly right for the circumstances, and those rules can allow exceptions to those rules in order to get us through it. That was one of the things that got us through it last time. We were almost toast. So the notion of trying to do it perfectly with written rules that are going to be followed and adhered to perfectly is risky to me. Brancaccio, you seem to be assuming that you have grown-ups on the left and the right in power in Washington if the next disaster befalls us. Dalio, I'm saying I'm setting the bar high enough. I could easily imagine that you could have a crisis in which those people don't agree. The greater crisis is not getting through it, rather than getting through it perfectly. Look, we got through this one. If you want to make a big deal of whether one company got the loan and another company didn't, and you expect that that's going to be examined perfectly at that time in the middle of the whole mess, you're being naive. It won't happen that way. It'll be a lot of companies going down, and then all of a sudden you're going to stigmatize one company and not stigmatize another, and you're going to bankrupt them. And even just the bankruptcy procedures and the nationalization, all of that is incredibly difficult, incredibly cumbersome. The important thing is to get through it well. Consider it like an automobile accident. Don't worry about being precise. Get the adrenaline into that patient and get their heart going again, and then try to handle it. When you look at most of how this was handled, and you look at the economics of this, the government made money on all of this in terms of the assistance. Brancaccio, in the fullness of time. Dalio, in the fullness of time. Get us through it. That's the main thing. Brancaccio, all right. There's one little detail here about this new book of yours. Can you download it for free? Dalio, yeah, I wanted to make it free for everybody on PDF if you go to principles.com. Brancaccio, the idea is that, so this book is free that I'm about to check out. So if you want to check out a free book, principles.com apparently. Brancaccio, the idea is you wanted these ideas out there for people. Why is that debt crisis cycle so important for people to understand? Dalio, we do this thing over and over again for the same reasons. And it's like having a disease in which someone hasn't taken the time and understand the progression of that disease. I'm at a stage in my life where I want to pass along the things that have been helpful to me. This has been helpful to me over these last 4 or 5 decades, and I want to pass it along and hopefully reduce the chances of it happening again or help people handle it better. And I think that's the more likely thing. It's going to happen again because it's based in human psychology. All right. Well, that is it for 5-Year Club video number 299. Hope you enjoyed it. This is that principles.com website. You can get the book free as a PDF. Ray Dalio's excellent study provides an innovative way of thinking about debt crises and the policy response. Cool. Looks like you'll have to feed them an email address. Oops. All right. Have a fabulous evening.